Welcome to the second of two screencasts focusing on exam skills for the introductory course section of the SY1 AS Sociology exam. So in the previous screencast we focused on how to answer the 5-mark question, and what we're going to do in this video is focus on the 10-mark question. So the 10-mark question on the first section of the SY1 exam is always a question on either socialisation or social control. And with this question, you've got to go beyond simply defining these concepts, and you've got to move towards a more detailed description of how the processes of either socialisation or social control actually work. Obviously, make sure that you read the question really carefully, because some questions might be quite specific and they might ask you to focus on primary socialisation or secondary socialisation, whereas some questions might require you to look at both stages of socialisation. You need to use the item, so you need to go back to this text that they provided you and try to link some of your examples to the item. And then finally, in terms of knowledge, it's really important when you're describing the processes of socialisation and social control to use technical terms. So try to use as many concepts as you can when you're answering the 10-mark question. What you can see on the screen at the moment is the mark scheme for this section of the exam. So we can see 5 marks for knowledge, and you've got to provide a number of detailed, accurate and relevant points to get maximum marks for knowledge. And then there are 5 further marks for analysis, and this is about the clarity of your explanation and also your ability to link your explanation to the material provided in the item. And with this question, it's not enough to simply define what socialisation is or what social control is. This question, your answer has got to focus on how these processes of socialisation or social control actually work. And in order to do this, you'll obviously need lots of concrete examples of how specific agencies of socialisation transmit culture and control people. So as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to use a range of sociological terms in your answer. So for example, if the 10-mark question was about the process of socialisation, here are some examples of some of the concepts that you should try and use to describe how the process of socialisation works. And just be aware, by the way, that sometimes instead of using the term socialisation, they might use the term cultural transmission. That's just another way of talking about socialisation. And of course the family, the education system, the mass media, the peer group are all examples of important agencies of socialisation. So obviously if you were to get a question on primary socialisation, you would need to focus specifically on the family. And if the question was about secondary socialisation, then you could focus on things like schools, the mass media and the peer group. I've highlighted these 2 in red because later on in the course we're going to be looking at youth culture and the sociology of the mass media in a lot more detail. So as you get into your sociology course and you start to look at these other topics in detail, you should be able to transfer some of that knowledge to these 10-mark questions. Also I put gender here as an example. Some questions ask you to talk about how socialisation is linked to social roles. And a really good example to talk about if we're looking at social roles is the process of gender role socialisation. And when you're describing the process of gender role socialisation, try and use specialist terms. Try and use words like canalisation, which remember is where parents direct or channel their children's interests towards games and toys that are seen as being gender specific. Or you could also use this idea of verbal appellations when you're describing the way in which language is used to label children in gender-specific ways. And if the question is about social control, here are some of the key words that you should try and use in your answer, and here are specific examples that you can use to describe the process of social control. So it's really important, obviously, before the exam to go back to the screencasts on culture, socialization, social control, and really make sure that you are fully aware of all of the concepts and examples that are described in those screencasts. So obviously, as part of your private study, you've got to keep on going back over definitions and examples of key concepts. And remember, there's this Quizlet set of flashcards called Culture and Socialization that will help you learn definitions of the key concepts required for this section of the SY1 exam. We're going to finish this screencast by looking at some examples. So what I'd like you to do in a moment is to hit the pause button, read through this item carefully, and then have a look at the 10-mark question. And I'd like you to write a partial answer to the 10-mark question. So what I'd like you to do for the 10-mark question is to define the key terms. So there are two key terms here that need to be defined. See if you can put into your own words what is meant by agencies of socialization and also what is meant by gender roles. And then when you define those key terms, I'd like you to write one paragraph focusing on how the family as an agency of socialization can influence gender roles. So hit the pause button, read the item, read the question, define the terms agents of socialization and gender roles, and write a paragraph focusing on how the family might influence gender roles. And what I'd like you to do now is to compare what you've written with the model answer that you can see on the screen at the moment. So here we've got definitions of the key terms, and it's always good practice at the beginning of your 10-mark question to define the key terms that are used in the question. And here's an attempt to describe how the family as a primary agency of socialization influences gender roles. And hopefully you can see that in this model answer there's good use of sociological terms. So obviously we've got the terms from the question, so agencies of socialization, gender roles. We've got reference to culture. We've got reference to terms like masculinity and femininity. We've got the term agent of socialization used again, gender roles used again. We've got primary socialization. We've got this process of canalization that we've talked about. We've got use of the term verbal appellations. And all of this is also supported with really good examples that show an understanding of these key concepts. Now, in addition to describing the way in which the family influences gender roles, your answer would also need to contain some analysis of how schools can also influence gender roles. And the reason that you need to focus on the role of schools is the question, remember, always instructs you to use material from the item. And as we can see on the screen at the moment, in the item, the example used is the role that schools play as a secondary agency of socialization. So what we can see underneath the question is a further paragraph showing how we could use the example of schools and develop some of the material from the item to show how that can influence gender roles. And once again, we can also see the use of key sociological words. So we've got, again, the term agent of socialization that's used in the question. We've got reference to gendered norms and values. We've got use of the sociological term, the hidden curriculum. We've got education correctly identified as a secondary agency of socialization. We've got the idea of cultural transmission. We've got this idea of role models and imitation as a process of socialization. So once again, good use of specialist terms. Let's look at one final example. This time it's a question about social control. So have a read through the item and have a read through this question, and then we'll have a look at a model answer again. What I'd like you to do with this model answer in a moment is to hit the pause button, see if you can identify the key sociological words that are used within this answer. And also the other thing that I want you to have a think about is whether or not there is anything that is missing from this question. So there's good use of sociological terminology throughout this answer. So we've got, as we would expect, a clear definition of social control at the beginning. That's linked to other concepts like norms and values and culture. We've got this distinction between informal and formal social control. We've got reference to the idea of sanctions as one of the ways in which social control works. We've got this idea of role models. We've got reference to feminism. We've got reference to agents of socialization. And all the time, these concepts are related to the issue of social control, and there are good examples that demonstrate understanding of these key words. However, although this is a good answer, hopefully what you've noticed is the missing ingredient is a reference to the item. And remember, this is a very specific requirement of the question, so it will always ask you to use material from the item. So bringing everything together, in order to get the best possible mark on this section of the exam, you need to make sure that your answer starts with a clear explanation of any of the sociological terms that are used in the question. You need to make sure that you answer the question set. So if the question, let's say, is about primary socialization, then your focus needs to be on the family. If the question is about secondary socialization, then you need to focus on an agency that's involved with that stage of socialization. So answer the question set. Make sure that you use a good range of sociological terms within your answer, and also make sure that you've got lots of very specific examples to show off your understanding of how the process of socialization or social control actually happens. And that analysis has got to include links to the item, as we've just seen. And finally, a reminder about time management. With all of the AS Sociology papers, the golden rule is a minute a mark. So for this section of the exam, it's 10 minutes.